Okay, thanks so much. Thank you so much to everyone for coming along today, and thank you for bearing with us with all of this, these tech issues. My name is Adam Stock. My preferred pronouns are he, him. I live in Newcastle. I am an academic, a senior lecturer in English literature at York St John University, and I'm interested in my research in the political nature of narratives. And I'm a modnik. I joined NatMod earlier this year because it really appealed to me as a Jewish communal space which organises around injustice and inequality from a specifically Jewish perspective. Tomer?
Hi, I'm Tomer. I'm also an academic. I'm a health researcher. I live in the West Midlands, not far from where Limmud would normally be taking place in person. And I was involved in setting up NatMod about 3 years ago, along with a group of other people, because we wanted to kind of move forward questions around the occupation and conversations about Israel-Palestine in our community that we felt were necessary, including the ones that we're hopefully going to have here today. I'll just say at the start that I've kind of got a weird echo, so I hope you can't hear that. And if it distracts me at any point, I'm sorry. But yeah, hopefully we'll be able to work through that as a tech issue.
Okay, thank you. So we want to kick off by making it clear, what happens with Limmud is you submit a session title, you submit a little blurb, and then you go away. 2 months later, you think about writing the session, and you think, I wish I'd changed the blurb and the title a little bit. And we want to start making it clear, despite what the title says, that anti-Palestinian racism is not unique to the Jewish community. It's not a problem unique here. It's not even potentially significantly worse in the Jewish community than in some other communities. Because like all racism, it's a societal problem. It can manifest in every part of society, and that, of course, includes Jewish communities. But like anti-Semitism, I think it can come to the surface perhaps a little more frequently when Israel-Palestine is discussed, and that happens quite a lot in the Jewish community. So we think it's important to talk about it in the Jewish community because we're all connected to the Jewish community. We care about it, and we've witnessed anti-Palestinian racism within it. We also think that solidarity is a requirement, an absolute requirement for eliminating all forms of oppression. That includes anti-Semitism and other oppressions that Jews might experience. We want to make sure conversations and actions about opposing oppression address anti-Palestinian racism too. So a little tiny bit about NatMod then, where we're coming from. We are a movement of British Jews seeking to end our community support for the occupation and to mobilise in the struggle for freedom, equality and justice for all Palestinians and Israelis. We are a very pluralistic movement. We are a broad shul. We welcome anyone who shares our goals and values. This includes Zionists, it includes anti-Zionists, it includes others who identify outside or between those two terms. There is a question then about why we are concerned with anti-Palestinian racism in the British Jewish community if we've got this specific focus on anti-occupation action. What's the connection? Well, we think there is a connection here because the discourse of anti-Palestinian racism is used both within and outside Israel to help normalize and justify supporting the occupation. And that discriminates against Palestinians in a structural way. So what you can see now, hopefully on the screen, is a slide from a deck we use in sessions that introduce people to who we are, what we do, and why. We show this on your screen at the moment to help explain where our current campaign called Racism Isn't Kosher is coming from. We don't expect everyone here to agree with us, and if you want to discuss these ideas, we really recommend attending the other session, which NatMod is running at Limmud later on in Limmud, about who we are, what we do. Today we have really limited time, especially with tech issues, so we want to really focus on anti-Palestinian racism, as that's what the session is about. Okay, so before we get started then, just as a little bit of framing, we think it's really important to discuss some values. It's a very sensitive topic. It's a topic that can be quite difficult to discuss. So first of all, it's not a zero-sum game. This isn't Jews versus Palestinians. It's not Arabs versus Israelis or anything like that. We're not interested here in hierarchies of oppression. We all experience oppression. We all have a role to play in challenging it. The second thing that I want to stress is that learning to be anti-racist is really hard. It's not the same as being non-racist, okay? Learning to be anti-racist is really hard. It involves unlearning really long-held prejudices and biases, and that can be really uncomfortable. The rapper and educator Akala has said, we tend to focus on individual acts of prejudice, but the issue of race is a lot more insidious. And it takes a lot more of a historical view to understand the difference between individual bias and structural racism and privilege. So what we want you to do today is just to try to sit a little with the discomfort. Remember that racism is structural. It's not just a question of interpersonal morality, i.e., only bad people are racist. It's something that we're all trying to unlearn. And we understand because it's something that we in the Jewish community have gone through and continue to go through. Finally, solidarity is a two-way street. We think it's really good that the Jewish community are doing work on anti-racism. In the past few days, we've seen some strong condemnation by many leaders and bodies against the Islamophobic statements made by the head of a UK branch of a Jewish Israeli charity. And we're really looking forward to the recommendation of the Commission on Racial Inclusivity being fully implemented. We know this is work that's important and has already begun. We worry, though, that within our community, there sometimes is something of a blind spot when it comes to anti-Palestinian racism. So finally, we just want to not acknowledge that the three of us are Aussie Jews. We do have Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in Limmud too. We're informed allies, but we have not ourselves been on the receiving end of anti-Palestinian racism. We've worked with individuals and groups, and particularly I'd like to highlight Obada Shtaya, who works for the Palestinian organization Zimam. Obada joined us on several Zoom calls over the last week. And finally, I want to acknowledge that as Jews, we have experienced anti-Semitism personally. We also acknowledge the weight of historical trauma under which all of us still collectively live. And at a time when anti-Semitism has been so much a part of public discourse, this often feels really present in our lives. Traumatized people can sometimes project trauma onto others. They can try to shut down conversations about the trauma of others by talking about their own pain and centering themselves. And this, I think, makes all anti-racist work and education both hard and extremely necessary for us as Jews, because we are so close to it. Okay, so with all of that as our kind of framework, let's move on to thinking a little bit about some common tropes about Palestinians. And we're going to describe a number of tropes because we think this is the most helpful way to prompt learning and discussion and to equip everyone to recognize and challenge those tropes when you encounter them in the Jewish community and elsewhere. So while you're listening to this section, please start to think about any questions and comments you may have and submit them in the chat box, which I hope I can find. I haven't managed to yet. And we'll pause in a few minutes to answer and discuss as many of them as we can.
I think in the interest of time, I'll try and take this section. But yeah, with the full acknowledgement that Anne had a really important role in devising these, and actually she has some academic expertise in them, which I'm afraid I can't offer. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if I can do them justice, but hopefully. So the first trope that we want to talk about is the idea that Palestinians don't exist. And this is one that is expressed in a number of different ways. I've certainly heard it in a number of different contexts. The idea, there's a comment here which was taken from a Jewish Facebook group, a British Jewish Facebook group, that Palestinians are just Arabs, kind of homogenizing them with all other Arab people in the region. And you hear, I've certainly heard, I remember growing up, even from people who were nominally quite supportive of the Palestinian cause and the idea of some sort of manifesting national rights for Palestinians, saying things like, oh, well, the Palestinian people were invented by Yasser Arafat or by other people around the 1960s, and they didn't really exist as a true people before the creation of the State of Israel. And I've even heard this in kind of people saying, for example, that because there's no letter P in Arabic, therefore the Palestinian people can't exist. Clearly, this isn't true. You only need to meet a Palestinian to know that they are a real people. But what this trope can serve to do is, first of all, deny their connection to the land of Israel-Palestine, and therefore any rights they have within it, any claim they have to any land within it. It also diminishes their identity, which can be a very hurtful thing for them to experience. And of course, by doing all of this, by in essence dehumanizing them to an extent, claiming that their any rights they have to the land or the region are illegitimate or manufactured, serves to justify discrimination that they do experience and human rights violations that they do experience, which is how some of these tropes can kind of play into the material racism that Palestinians experience within Israel-Palestine. So yeah, that's one very widespread trope that we can hear. If we move on to the next slide, another very common trope which you can hear in the discourse around Israel-Palestine is the idea that Israel or Israelis made the desert bloom. Now this is really where Anne's contribution would be really helpful, because this is what she sort of did her PhD on. This idea of making the desert bloom didn't originate in the context of Israel-Palestine. It actually existed far before that in the context of British colonialism and French colonialism and other European colonialism, particularly in Africa. And actually there was a very Christian narrative around that, or evangelical narrative, in the idea that the reason there was such widespread desert or poor agriculture in Africa, for example, was that God was punishing these people for not being Christians. So actually this idea is a bit kind of recycled in the context of Israel-Palestine. There's no question at all that Israel is the land is a very different place to how it was before the state of Israel was created. And of course, things that Jewish Israelis did in the creation of the state of Israel is the transformations today are the product of that work. But actually, the reason why this idea of making the desert bloom is so pernicious and harmful is that it implies, again, that before Israel was created, there was desert, there was nothing there. We hear this slightly differently in the idea that Israel was a land without a people, for a people without a land. And of course, it wasn't a land without a people. There were Palestinians, many Palestinians who lived there before the state of Israel was created. And using these ideas, these tropes, again, kind of serves to sever their connection to the land, deny their heritage to it and their rights within it. And also, I think you can imagine how and empathize with how harmful and hurtful it would be for Palestinians to have that connection severed and have the idea perpetuated that they just didn't exist before the creation of the state of Israel. And so I think, this is one that we really have to be very mindful around whenever we talk about Israel, which again, lots of our community feel immense pride in and a strong connection to, but making sure that we're not diminishing Palestinian connection to the land while we do that, and perpetuating false narratives. That's a really good question, Natasha. I'm sorry for skipping over that. This was just kind of connecting these two images here. Often the narrative around that can happen around donations to Israel and the idea of planting trees in Israel is that there was a desert there, and the state of Israel, all the work that happened before its creation and since its creation, particularly philanthropy from Jews in the diaspora, was about making the desert bloom. Obviously, planting a tree in Israel is not inherently an act of anti-Palestinian racism. That's not the suggestion at all. I apologize, that was confusing. It was a broader narrative here about the idea that there was a desert that is now in bloom, particularly that the land was deserted before Jews moved there or started sending philanthropy there to kind of cultivate it, if that makes sense. I hope that addresses your question. Okay, now we're going to move on to another very pernicious trope, which is Nakba denial or minimization. For those who don't know, the Nakba is the Palestinian term for the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians around the creation of the state of Israel in 1948. Some of it happened before the formal creation of the state, some of it happened afterwards. But it's an undeniable historical fact that hundreds and thousands of Palestinians were displaced. And of course, as with any mass displacement, that comes with huge trauma and hurt and violence, and is a deeply tragic act. We saw a particularly harmful example of this just a year ago, when the Israeli ambassador Tzipi Hotovely was giving a talk at a Board of Deputies event, where she described the Nakba as an Arab lie. You can see another quote here she used in this image. She says the Arabs made up a story that is called the Nakba. And I think, as Jews, we particularly understand the intense hurt and harm of denying, systemic racism and discrimination we've experienced, and ethnic cleansing, and how and the ramifications that can have more broadly for us and our safety. And so, just the fact that anyone is denying it at all or diminishing it is really, really appalling, to be quite frank. Even if we don't hear kind of direct Nakba denial, sometimes you can also hear kind of a slightly a different form of this, which is Nakba minimization or kind of excusing of the Nakba. There's an example on the right here from an article in the Jewish Chronicle, which says the cause of the Nakba was Arab rejectionism, and that it's kind of Arab leaders' fault that the Nakba took place, and if they'd just done something different, there wouldn't have been a Nakba. I think, the creation of the State of Israel is very emotional for all of us. It was, like all events in history, it's deeply complex with competing narratives. But I think on face value, we can see how hurtful and harmful it is to suggest that people who were the victims of displacement and undeniable violence in many instances were themselves the cause of that violence or displacement. I think, again, we can see how harmful that is. Other times you can kind of hear the Nakba being diminished, or saying that it's, people should only talk about it if they acknowledge the trauma experienced by Jews from Arab countries who were displaced after the creation of the State of Israel. Of course, those Jews absolutely experienced immense trauma and harm as well, and what happened to them was wrong. But I think bringing that up to diminish the experience of Palestinians in the Nakba is harmful, and we should be able to acknowledge the harm experienced to both these people and within both these incidents independently in their own right, rather than kind of using one to compete against another. This goes back to what Adam was saying before about not having competing narratives or oppression Olympics or anything like that. Now we can move on. I don't know, do you want to pick up here, Adam?
Okay, so there's some questions about the history of the creation of the State of Israel 1947 partition plan. I don't know if you want to speak to either of those, Tomer. They're quite similar comments. Or whether we want
Absolutely. I mean, as I said before, all events in history have competing narratives. Particularly, I think that's probably as true, if not truer, with the context of Israel-Palestine than any other. And, of course, people are going to take different views on what should have happened in 1947. But the fact is that, again, it's undeniable that hundreds and thousands of Palestinians did experience intense violence and were displaced. And, it wasn't their fault. Whatever happened, whatever decisions were made by whichever leaders, the fact is, they experienced displacement. We all acknowledge that's, that's a wrong thing to happen in any context, and those Palestinians themselves were not responsible for the decisions of any kind of senior people who were taking the political decisions that happens around the creation of the State of Israel. So I think what I'm really trying to do here, and what we're trying to do in this session, is kind of a focus on the humanity of Palestinians, looking at them as people like us, who experience racism and have experienced racism historically. So I think, the important thing here is we need to, I don't believe that any displacement is ever justifiable, whatever the decisions of political leaders. And I think, that's a view that's shared by most people. We talk about this in a lot of other contexts in the Jewish community. So it's important that, whatever we think the right resolution is to the situation now, we shouldn't, try and make excuses for what happened to Palestinians, and especially shouldn't kind of diminish their harm or their connection to the land. There was actually just one comment I wanted to pick on, which I thought was really good, from Ruvi Ziegler, who said there is often a Schrodinger's cat approach to the Nakba, with people saying both that the displacement did not happen, but also that if it did happen, or when it did happen, it was those displaced people's fault. So there's two kind of completely contradictory narratives people adopting simultaneously, and I think that's a really good way of kind of encapsulating some of what we were trying to convey in this session. So thank you, Ruvi. So another very common trope you can hear is the idea that Palestinians are inherently violent. Actually, this isn't a trope which is limited to Palestinians or only applied to Palestinians. It's often applied to particularly people of colour in a whole range of contexts around the world, including in the UK. We see this perpetuated in political discourse, in pop culture and mass media and things. So it's definitely not unique to Palestine or Palestinians. However, within the context of Israel-Palestine, this trope can often be used to kind of portray Palestinians as uniquely responsible for any conflict that happens in the region, and can be used to dehumanize Palestinians. I think on the left here, we've got a quote from the Jewish News, which came from a prominent rabbi in the community. And actually, this trope has been used, this quote has been used again since 2018 when it was published. The idea that Israel is a light unto the nations, an oasis of civilization in the midst of a desert of savagery, a powerful lighthouse in the darkest corner of earth. Again, as I hope I've touched upon in previous slides, many or most British Jews and Jews around the world feel a deep connection to Israel, feel immense pride in Israel, and do, for a whole range of reasons, see it as a light unto the nations. I think that what's really problematic about this quote is it goes beyond that and says that it's a light amongst a desert of savagery, portraying all the people who, the kind of non-Jews, the people who surround Israel, as savages. And I think, we see this applied to other people of color as well in different contexts, but it really dehumanizes these people to describe them as, or to allude to the fact that they're savages or primitive in some way. I think we can all understand how hurtful and racist anyone would feel that was if that was applied to them. And again, it contributes to this dehumanization, which in turn, this dehumanization and suggesting that they're kind of responsible for violence and conflict in the region can actually, again, lead into this material discrimination they experience, because it can be used to sort of indirectly justify subjecting them to collective punishment. The idea that Palestinians are all incredibly violent, so they need to be kept under collectively punitive measures for the safety of others. Just to bring in this picture on the right and to make it clear, we can hear this extended sometimes to the idea that Palestinian flags, for example, or symbols of Palestinian identity are a threat in and of themselves. I know I've heard this in the Jewish community about people saying that marches for Palestinian rights or Palestinian flags feel like a threat to Jewish life. And that's absolutely not to deny in any way that anti-Semitism can be expressed within Palestinian solidarity, within Palestinian solidarity movement. Adam said that at the start of this session. And of course, Jews can be harmed by people under the guise of supporting Palestinian rights. But what isn't the case is that Palestinian flags, or simply, being Palestinian and advocating for Palestinians, is in and of itself inherently violent and a threat. And actually, as I hope I've explained, I think that can play into much more problematic ideas which justify racism towards Palestinians. Should we move on, Adam? Great.
Yeah.
So another trope, which I certainly remember hearing a lot when I was growing up in discourse around Israel-Palestine, is the idea that they don't love their children. And this isn't or it's very commonly expressed in this quote, which is attributed to Golda Meir. Actually, there's not very clear evidence that she said it, but it's this quote which says, "We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us." I think on face value, I hope people can recognize how hurtful and dehumanizing it is to suggest that Palestinians don't love their children. From a purely human perspective, we can recognize that all people around the world, irrespective of their ethnicity or faith, love their children. It's one of the common threads that unites us as people. And so, it's incredibly hurtful to suggest that Palestinians don't love their children. It's very dehumanizing, again, kind of portraying them as the perpetrators of violence, and in a way kind of legitimizing some of the discrimination they experience. A different way this can be expressed is the idea that Palestinians use their children as pawns. This is expressed in a number of different ways, but one, for example, is the idea that Palestinians incite their children to be terrorists or to hate Jews through, for example, textbooks in schools. Actually, in reality, all the independent research has been conducted on this shows that, yes, again, there are examples of anti-Semitism in Palestinian textbooks, but it's not nearly as widespread as many or some people or groups make out. And kind of, yes, the academic evidence suggests that this is a really overinflated problem. And I think the reason why this idea can be kind of perpetuated, that Palestinians are inciting their children, is, again, it plays into this dehumanization of Palestinians, and again, it's kind of used to justify the discrimination they experience and to deny the reality of racism they experience structurally from the occupation in particular. So the last trope I want to talk about, again, of course, there are many more, but we've chosen to focus on a select few in this session, is the idea that Palestinians are duplicitous. And I think one way that we see this expressed is this idea of Pallywood. I remember hearing this a lot when I was growing up, the idea that Palestinians fake the human rights abuses they experience in order to generate sympathy, which is unjustified in some way. One of the earliest examples of this is the image on the left, when a Palestinian child was shot on the border of Gaza. And very quickly, various people tried to discredit this and suggest it was faked in some way. I think it's really clear to see how problematic this is, to kind of, when a child is shot, that should just be acknowledged as a truly tragic incident. And I think the natural human response should be to mourn that child and to try and take any steps to ensure what happened to them never happens to anyone absolutely ever again. And I think the efforts that people go to try and discredit some of these incidents, that's just one of many, many, many that I know I've seen over the years. Plays into this trope about Palestinians being duplicitous in some way, about falsely seeking sympathy, to deny the human rights abuses that in Limmud we know is a reality. We hear from Israeli and Palestinian partners is a reality of what they experience, and the right response to that, we feel, should be to challenge those human rights abuses and ensure that it doesn't happen to anyone again, rather than to try and discredit the Palestinians who are saying that, and again playing into this idea that they're false and working into that dehumanization. So the last thing that we wanted to talk about is that when we were planning this session, and particularly when we were in dialogue with Palestinian partners like Obada, who we mentioned before, and others who we spoke to about this work and this campaign, is as we were talking about these tropes that are often applied to Palestinians, it really became clear how many parallels there were with the anti-Semitism that we had experienced and knew about in various different contexts. We didn't want to go through this session and say, here's an example of anti-Palestinian racism, here's a comparable example of anti-Semitism, because all racisms, and particularly we know anti-Semitism, do operate uniquely, it isn't, we can't compare them apples for apples. But I hope throughout this session, maybe some of the tropes that we've talked about have drawn recognition from you about how they apply to anti-Semitism you're aware of, or experienced in some way. The blood libel, for example, the idea that Jews are a threat to children in some way, or bloodthirsty. The idea that the Jews are scheming, the classic example being Fagin in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. Of course, Holocaust denial, or blaming Jews in some way for the Holocaust, or collaborating in the Holocaust. These are all ones that occurred to us. If you've thought of other ones, or if this generates thoughts for you about different ones, then yeah, we'd be really interested to hear them in the chat or in the Q&A section. I'm going to hand back to Adam at this point.
Thank you. I'm just having a little look at the Q&A section. I think most people, no, we do have some here now. We've got things both in the chat and in the Q&A, and we've got a little bit of time for these before we quickly wrap up at the end. We did want to make this session as sort of dialogic as possible. It's been really great to see people engaging with each other in the chat. I think it's important to try and be open about this in a sort of good faith dialogue. We were going to try and unmute people and let them talk, but I fear that we're having so many problems with the tech today that might just be a step too far. But please do continue to use the chat box and the Q&A. In terms of the Q&A, Alan Silman's asked, is it helpful to distinguish between anti-Palestinian racism against Palestinians who live in Israel-Palestine, and whether it exists to Palestinians in the diaspora? And there's a kind of a similar parallel question from Ben Bernheim, which is that you've spoken a lot about the Jewish community, but there are a lot of them around the world. Have you found attitudes towards Palestinians very different in British, French, and American communities? So they're both questions really, I think, about diasporas and any differences between racism being experienced within the direct Israel-Palestine context and outside that in diasporas. And if I briefly speak to that, I'll say, of course, there are differences in how this racism is experienced. Something that Bada talks about is that, of course, there are not the responses of Palestinians to different forms of racism is, of course, not the same. Just as in the Jewish community, we all have quite different ideas about perhaps even what anti-Semitism is, how we define it, and how we experience it in the diaspora and elsewhere. I think that in terms of, so if we think about sort of structural issues here, we might say, for example, one way that Palestinians experience racism structurally in the UK is that people traveling on a Palestinian passport need a visa to come into the UK. They need a visa for entry. People traveling on an Israeli passport do not. And we might want to think about some of the underlying assumptions and values that lead to that distinction being made. Tome, do you have anything to add about this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question from Alan, and certainly, we wouldn't want to equate the experience of racism directly of Palestinians in the diaspora in the UK or elsewhere with Palestinians in Israel-Palestine. Of course, anti-Palestinian racism in Israel-Palestine is very immaterial, as Adam said. It's experienced by the discrimination they face, particularly around the occupation, but also in many other contexts. It's structural, it's legislative in many ways. So it's not the same as what Palestinians are experiencing here. Just the same as the anti-Semitism that Jews experience in Israel-Palestine is very different to the anti-Semitism we experience here. So I think it's important to draw that distinction, but I hope particularly Adam's context at the beginning showed how there are kind of links and connections between the two kind of forms of racism, as it were, or two experiences of racism, and how some of those tropes play into that. And I think Adam, just gave a really good example of how there still is and can be structural racism towards Palestinians within the UK.
Anne would just like to contribute particularly to the second question about different communities around the world, that we have found that other communities have some similar prejudices against Palestinians, although the American Jewish community is one that she knows quite a bit about, and the Islamic community there does do a lot of interfaith work. So of course it does vary a little bit by national context, as hopefully my example there also showed. So there's some really nice things in the chat box about some links. So V. Weinman has said that another trope is the link with Nazism, about the trope that Palestinians collaborated. Of course, there's also a parallel there, which has been expressed that that Zionists in the 1930s collaborated with the Nazis. It's again, that's something famously that what's his name, Livingstone, said, the ex-mayor of London. So yeah, that's something that also has a lot of parallels. Benny is saying that I think one of the reasons for this session is to achieve mutual understanding and reconciliation. There needs to be mutual acknowledgement of each other's loss and pain. It's great that we're able to discuss this here, and I hope it's helping us to understand the questions we have to address together with Palestinians. So I think there's the real sense here that this is hard work, and I certainly within the chat box, some of the things I've seen mentioned are, I think, do still lean on some of these tropes, or exploring some of these tropes that are very much learned and taught to us sort of again and again, so that. And I think it's important for us to say, actually, what does this lean on? What's the evidence that this leans on? What's the material evidence that this leans on? And I think once you start looking a bit more closely, sometimes you can see that what you've always sort of assumed to be true might just be one particular narrative, and there are competing narratives that are also worthy of being mentioned. We're moving towards the end of this session. A couple more questions maybe I could just deal with Robert Stone's briefly. The Jewish community in the UK is not exactly homogenous. How do we deal with the fact that the loudest voices are the most prejudiced? I would say that sometimes that's the case, but that's up to us to change it in terms of who we promote. Certainly, Natamod, we try to make a big noise about our perspective. It's certainly something we're very conscious of we're trying to promote ourselves. Have you got anything to add here, Tomer?
Not really, just that, yeah, there have been some really good questions about what do we actually do about this? Yeah, linked to what Robert was saying as well. And also good questions about, at what point is it kind of airing our dirty laundry and things? Obviously, we're not doing it public here because Limmud is a Jewish space, but it is a really good question about that lots of Jews feel very sensitive about. But I think, yeah, hopefully, those are questions we'd love to explore further through, engagement beyond this session with Natamod. And I think Adam's going to talk about that a bit in this slide now, wrapping up.
Definitely, yeah. So this session, as we say, is part of our ongoing Racism Isn't Kosher campaign. We'd love to hear from you in terms of sharing your experiences, your personal stories, anytime you encountered anti-Palestinian racism, for example, in the Jewish community. Any particular things that perhaps this session threw up some things that you think you might have to think again about? Are there things that perhaps you have learned that you want to question and explore a little more and find out a bit more about? Please do contact us. You can email us information@natamod.org.uk. You can join Natamod if you haven't already. Please do join us. We have fairly regular orientation sessions which take place online. And again, you can find out more about that by visiting our website, or which is natamod.org.uk, or by emailing us, following us on the socials, as I say, and there you can also find some of the other sessions that we're excited about at Limmud this year. So that's at Natamod UK is both our Twitter and Instagram handle, and we've got a Facebook page too. You can search for us there. And our web address, as I said, is natamod.org.uk. We do have one more session, Natamod. It's on Tuesday. It's at 5 p.m. UTC, and it's called "Why Natamod is Calling for Actions, Not Words on the Occupation." So if you were particularly interested in the sort of finding out a bit more about that and some of that campaign that we're pushing for at the moment, please do come along and join in that session. We've got one more slide to end with, and this is our takeaways for today. So these are, I think, the points that we really want you to kind of keep in your minds as you leave this event. And there's three that I think are really important to me. Firstly, the three of us. Firstly, that tropes and discourses, the ones that are discussed today, help perpetuate inequalities and oppression faced by Palestinian people today. I've mentioned one about Britain and passports, but there's lots of others we could go through if we had the time. The second one is that anti-Palestinian racism is not just a problem within the Jewish community. We don't want to sort of, flail ourselves as being unique here in the world. In fact, people who face similar inequalities and oppression, it's important for us to tackle it within our community precisely because of that. But that doesn't make it unique to the Jewish community at all. And finally, unlearning is difficult, it's uncomfortable. Often the first reaction that you may have had today is to feel a little bit defensive, to feel that, oh, but I know this for a fact. And actually, it's hard to sit with that discomfort. It can be difficult, but it's a process. And I hope that we have started you in a sort of very first baby steps along that process. So do please be kind to yourself and accept that if this is a journey you would like to take, and I really hope it is for many of you, that it is a process that will be ongoing and you'll need to keep going. And that is it. Yeah, that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for all coming along, for such a wonderful generative chat in the chat box. And thank you again. And apologies that Anne couldn't join in, but she's been very helpful in our side channel that we've been had up on screen as well. So thanks for all of her work.